She's been bleeding him dry, Spencer told the whole reunion. So by Sunday night, I handed him the court order that took it all back. The room went quiet, the way a room does right before something breaks. And then my cousin Spencer lifted his beer toward me across 40 of my own relatives and said, loud enough for the kids at the far table to hear, "Let's all thank Marlo. She's the reason Grandpa's accounts are empty. She's been bleeding him dry for 2 years." I was standing by the lodge's big stone fireplace with a paper plate of pulled pork going cold in my hand, and I heard the whole room inhale. The pine walls smelled like wood smoke and lake water and somebody's cheap sunscreen. Aunt Delphine actually gasped. My Uncle Roy set his fork down like the metal had gone hot, and Spencer just stood there in his $40 salmon-colored polo, grinning, letting it land, watching me the way you watch a fuse. $60,000 gone, he said. Ask her where it went. I didn't drop the plate. That surprised me later, thinking back on it, that my hand stayed level while every face I'd grown up with turned toward me and decided, in about 4 seconds, that I was a thief. What Spencer didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I already had the answer to his question, and it was folded in the inside pocket of the coat, hanging on the peg by the door. He thought he'd read every card in my hand. He'd read exactly none of them. My cousin was standing in a room, in front of the entire family, calling me a thief, and he had signed his own name to the very document that was going to end him. Let me back up, because you have to understand how we got to that fireplace, and you have to understand my grandfather's pocket watch, and you have to understand that I am the last person in that family anyone thought to be afraid of. I'm Marlo Hale. I'm 41. I grew up in Post Falls, Idaho, in a rented duplex on Celtis Way, with a water heater that gave out every February, and my mother cleaned rooms at the Red Lion in Coeur d'Alene for 19 years. We were not the branch of the family with money. That was always understood. My Uncle Gary, Spencer's father, sold commercial HVAC and had a boat, and every summer we'd all drive up to my grandfather's place on Hayden Lake, and the cousins would compare who had what, and I'd have nothing to put in, so I learned to listen instead. My grandfather was Walt Hale. He built docks, literally. That was his trade, marine construction, 41 years of it around the Idaho Panhandle. And his hands were the size of oven mitts, and he never once made me feel like the poor cousin. When I was 7, he took me out on Hayden Lake in an aluminum boat and pulled a brass pocket watch out of his coat, an old Waltham thing gone dark and green at the edges, tarnished so the numbers were hard to read, and he pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers over it. "You keep your own time, Marlo," he said. "Doesn't matter how fast the rest of the boat's going, you keep your own time." He let me hold it the whole ride back. Then he took it back, because it was his father's before him, but from then on, it was a thing between us. Ours. Nobody else in the family cared about that watch. Spencer, 2 years older than me, thought it was junk. He wanted the boat. I didn't go to college. I couldn't afford it. What I did instead was get a job at 19 filing documents at a title company in Coeur d'Alene, and I found out I was good at it. Good at the boring, careful, exact work of records, deadlines, signatures, chains of ownership. I got my notary commission at 22. I moved to a fiduciary services outfit at 26, and somewhere in there, I discovered I liked the thing most people find unbearable, reading the whole document, every line, the part nobody reads. By the time I was 35, I had spent 15 years working professionally as a fiduciary and a record specialist. I knew probate. I knew conservatorship. I knew what a valid power of attorney looked like and, more to the point, what a fake one looked like. But to the family, I was still just Marlo, Sharon's girl from the duplex, the quiet cousin who never had a boat. They had no idea what I did all day. They never asked. That was fine with me. That was, it turned out, the whole game. Spencer became somebody, or thought he did. He got into wealth management, the kind with a strip mall office and a lot of vocabulary, and he married Bree, who sold luxury real estate around Kootenai County and posted photos of herself in front of houses that weren't hers. They had a leased white Tahoe and a house in Hayden with a mortgage I later got to know intimately. They were always fine and always somehow in trouble. That combination should tell you everything. The good years were real, though. I want to be fair about that because it makes the rest worse. When Grandma Ruth died in 2016, Spencer cried at the funeral, and I believed him. When my grandfather's knees went and he moved into the smaller place on Government Way, Spencer and I actually worked together. I set up the online bill pay. Spencer drove him to the VA in Spokane. For about 3 years, we were a team, the 2 grandkids who showed up. I used to think of him as the closest thing I had to a brother. Then my grandfather started forgetting the names of streets he'd built docks on for 4 decades, and the money got interesting, and I learned who my cousin actually was. The first wrong note was small. This is how it always starts, a note so small you feel crazy for hearing it. It was March 2022. I'd driven Grandpa Walt to his cardiologist, and afterward, he wanted to stop at his credit union, the one on Northwest Boulevard, because he liked to check his balance on paper. He didn't trust screens. The teller printed his statement, and Grandpa's face did something I'd never seen. He put on his glasses. He read it twice. Then he handed it to me and said, "Marlo, they've made a mistake. There's supposed to be more than this." There was $4,200 in a checking account that had held over $11,000 the last time I'd looked. 2 withdrawals I didn't recognize. I told him it was probably a bill I'd forgotten to log, and I made a note in my phone and I filed it. That's the thing about being a records person. I don't panic, I document. I put the date and the number down, and I waited to see if it was a pattern or a fluke. It was a pattern. The second note was Spencer's new watch. April, at Grandpa's 81st birthday, at the Cracker Barrel off I-90, because that's what Grandpa liked. Spencer showed up in a Breitling. I know watches the way I know documents, carefully, from a distance, because I've never been able to afford the things I learn about. That was a $6,000 watch on a man whose wealth management clients were mostly retirees with annuities. Bree had a new Range Rover in the lot, and Grandpa reached for the check like he always did, and Spencer said, "Fast, I got it, Grandpa, put your wallet away," which sounds generous until you realize the money was Grandpa's anyway, just routed through Spencer first. I filed that too. The third note was the one that turned my stomach. In June, Grandpa mentioned, offhand, buttering a roll, that Spencer had me sign some papers so he could help with the accounts, so you don't have to worry about all that anymore, honey. He patted my hand when he said it. He thought he was doing me a kindness, taking the burden off me. I said, "That's great, Grandpa," and I smiled, and inside I went very cold and very still, because I knew the way you know a storm off the lake before the wind actually turns, that some papers meant a power of attorney, and that a power of attorney in Spencer's hands over a man who couldn't remember the name of Government Way was not help. It was a key to the vault. And here is the part I have never told anyone until now. 2 months earlier, in April 2022, I had done a thing quietly, on my own, without telling the family, because I could see where Grandpa was going, and I knew what I was trained to do. But I'll get to that. Timing is everything in this story, and it was everything then. The fourth note removed all doubt. In September, I did what I do. I pulled records. Grandpa had listed me on his accounts years back as an authorized signer, so I had the right. I sat at my kitchen table in Post Falls with the porch light flickering the way it always did when the fridge kicked on, and I laid the statements out in a grid, 12 months across, the way I lay out anything I mean to understand. And the pattern stood up off the table and looked at me. There was a check to Selkirk Fiduciary for $9,500. then another for $7,800, then $12,000. Selkirk Fiduciary was a name I half knew, a shell of a company, a registered LLC with Spencer's home address in Hayden as its principal. He'd invented a company that sounded like a real fiduciary firm, the kind I'd worked at, and he was writing my grandfather's money to it under his forged authority and calling it management fees. Over 18 months, by my count that night, he had moved just over $61,000 out of Walt Hale's accounts and into a company that existed only to eat them. I sat there until the porch light went still. I remember my socks were wet because I'd walked out to the mailbox in the rain and hadn't changed them, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me a little, that Spencer had made exactly one mistake, and he didn't even know he'd made it, and I was going to let him keep not knowing for as long as it took. Then the reunion got scheduled, and I understood he was going to do more than steal. He was going to frame me. Because Spencer is not just a thief. Spencer is a coward, and cowards always need someone else to be the villain, so the family looks the wrong way. Here's how the frame worked, and I have to hand it to him, it was almost clever. I was the one on the bank records. My name was the authorized signer that showed up on the accounts for years. Spencer's thefts ran through Selkirk Fiduciary, one layer removed, but the account itself, the one bleeding out, had my name attached to it as a signer. If you were a relative who didn't read documents, which was all of them, and Spencer stood up and said, "Look who's been on Grandpa's account this whole time. Look who had access," the arrow pointed at me. He'd spent 18 months building a story where the fiduciary, the actual thief, was the finger, and the fingerprint on the account was mine. He started seeding it early. That was the tell. In the weeks before the reunion, Aunt Delphine called me just to check in and asked, too casually, whether I'd noticed anything strange with Grandpa's money. My Uncle Roy stopped returning my texts. Bree posted something on Facebook about family members who take advantage of the elderly, with a little praying hands emoji, and got 60 likes, and I knew exactly who it was aimed at. The family was being prepared. The jury was being selected. And in that family, Spencer, with his Breitling and his vocabulary, was credible, and I was the poor cousin from the duplex who'd suddenly, they'd whisper, come into some money. That was the moment, sitting in my car outside the Fred Meyer on a Tuesday, phone in my lap, reading Bree's little post, that the last warm thing in me went quiet, and something else took its place. Not rage, I want to be precise, because rage is loud and what I felt was silent. It was the click of a lock. It was a records person looking at a document and seeing that all the signatures line up. I did not cry. I called Corinne. Corinne Aldis is an elder law attorney in Spokane, 63 years old, silver bob, reading glasses she wears on a chain, and she has forgotten more about the Idaho Conservatorship Code than most lawyers ever learn. I'd worked across the table from her on cases for years. She answered on the second ring, and I said, "Corinne, it's Marlowe. It's happening. He's moving on, Walt, and he's going to try to hang it on me at the reunion in July." She didn't say, "Oh no." She didn't say, "Are you sure?" She said, "Do you still have the order?" April of last year, I said, filed and signed by Judge Merritt, before Spencer ever got his POA. There was a small pause, and then Corinne said the thing I will love her for until I die. She said, "Then he doesn't have a power of attorney, honey. He has a piece of paper. Let's go get Walt's money back." Now here is the card. Here is what none of them knew. In April 2022, 2 months before Spencer ever slid his "some papers" across my grandfather's kitchen table, I had gone to court, quietly. I had seen where Grandpa's memory was going, and I had done the thing my 15 years had trained me to do. I petitioned the first judicial district court in Kootenai County to be appointed my grandfather's conservator. I brought his doctor's letter. I brought the records. Grandpa himself, in a good hour, sat with me in Corinne's office and said he wanted it to be me. "You keep your bearing," he told her, and she wrote it down. On April 19, 2022, Judge Merritt signed the order appointing me the court-appointed conservator of the estate of Walter James Hale. Let me say that plainly, because it is the whole point. A conservator is a person a judge puts legally in charge of another person's money when that person can't manage it themselves. The court did it, on the record, and once a court appoints a conservator, that person, me, controls the estate. Anything signed after that, by anyone, without the court's blessing, is worth exactly nothing. Spencer's power of attorney was signed in June 2022. My conservatorship order was signed in April 2022. His key opened a door that had already been sealed by a judge 2 months before he ever got it. He forged authority he could not have. Every dollar he pulled through Selkirk Fiduciary, he pulled without legal power, because I already had it. I wasn't the thief on the account. I was the officer of the court, standing on top of the whole thing, and he'd been embezzling in front of a judge without knowing the judge was there. I never told the family about the conservatorship, not because I was hiding money. A conservator can't touch the money. It's all bonded, and it all goes back to the court in an accounting every year, which I filed, on time, both years, to the dollar. I stayed quiet because Grandpa asked me to. He didn't want the family fussing, didn't want Gary and Delphine treating him like he was gone. "Keep it between us," he said. So I did. I kept his bearing for him, and I kept my mouth shut, and Spencer mistook my silence for weakness, the way his kind always does. The 3 months before the reunion were the quietest, most careful work I have ever done. And I did it the way you diffuse something, slowly, with your whole attention, refusing to hurry. Corinne and I built the file. First, the certified copy of the conservatorship order, with the clerk's raised seal, the real thing, not a printout. Second, the full accounting of Selkirk Fiduciary. I subpoenaed the LLC's bank records through the court, which a conservator can do, and there it all was, $61,400 total, moved in 14 transfers between June 2022 and March 2023. Every one of them landing in an account Spencer controlled, every one of them spent. The Breitling, the Range Rover down payment, 3 mortgage catch-up payments on the house in Hayden, a $4,000 charge at a resort in Cabo. Third, the forged POA itself, which I obtained a copy of, and which Corinne had reviewed by a document examiner in Spokane, who noted that the notary stamp on it belonged to a notary whose commission had expired in 2019. The whole instrument was garbage. It wasn't even a good forgery. And fourth, this was Corinne's idea, and it was the masterstroke. We didn't warn him. We didn't send a demand letter. We didn't tip the family. A lawyer's instinct is to fire off a letter and start a slow negotiation. Give the other side a chance to lawyer up and quietly settle in the dark. Corinne looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "He built this in front of everybody. He tried you in front of everybody. Idaho law lets a conservator recover misappropriated funds, and the court can order it. There's no reason this can't come out where it went in." She filed our motion to void the POA and claw back the funds on July 6th. The reunion was July 14th through 16th, a Friday to Sunday weekend, at the lodge on the north shore of Coeur d'Alene Lake that the family rented every third summer. Judge Merritt's order granting our motion, voiding Spencer's power of attorney as a legal nullity, and directing restitution of the full $61,400 with a freeze on the Selkirk fiduciary account, was signed on Friday, July 14th. The certified copy reached my hands by courier on Saturday morning. I drove up to the lodge Saturday with the watch in my coat pocket, the way I always carried it now. Grandpa had given it to me for keeps the previous Christmas, pressed it into my hand again, the way he had when I was 7, his hands shaking now, and said the same words, "You keep your own time," and the certified order in a plain manila envelope on the passenger seat. I remember the drive. I remember the lake coming up silver on my left through the tamaracks, and I remember being calm in a way that had nothing to do with feeling safe. I was calm because for the first time in 18 months, all the signatures lined up. Grandpa couldn't travel anymore by then. He was in memory care at a good place in Coeur d'Alene, and I'd stopped in to see him that morning. He didn't know it was reunion weekend. He knew me, though, that day. He held my hand and looked at the window for a while, and then he said, clear as anything, "Is the money all right, Marlo?" And I said, "It's all right, Grandpa. I've got it." I kept the bearing. He nodded like that was the only answer he'd ever expected from me, and he went back to watching the window. I got to the lodge Saturday evening. Spencer was already holding court on the deck in a quarter zip, telling 3 of the younger cousins about the market. Bree air-kissed me, and I could see her deciding I looked poor. Nobody said the word thief to my face that first night, but I felt it moving through the rooms like a draft. Roy wouldn't meet my eyes. Delphine hugged me too long. The pity hug, the one you give the guilty. I said goodnight early. I lay in the little pine-paneled room with the loon calls coming off the water and the ice machine down the hall clunking every 20 minutes, and I ran the sequence one more time in my head, the way I always check a file before it goes out, and I slept fine. Sunday was the big dinner. The whole family, 40-some people, the long tables, the pulled pork and the corn, and Delphine's potato salad. And Spencer, 3 beers in, decided he couldn't wait any longer to close his little case against me. He decided to do it at dinner, in front of the children, at the fireplace, the way I told you at the start. $60,000 gone, he said. Ask her where it went. So now you know everything I knew, standing there with the cold plate in my hand. And now I'll tell you what I did. I set the plate down on the mantel. I didn't raise my voice. I have never once in my life won anything by raising my voice, and I wasn't going to start in front of my grandfather's whole family. I walked to the peg by the door, and I heard 40 people watching me walk, and I took my coat down, and I took the manila envelope out of the inside pocket, next to the watch, and I felt the cold brass weight of it against my knuckles as I did. Then I walked back to the middle of the room, and I stood where Spencer had made me stand, and I said quietly, "You're right, Spencer. Let's ask where it went. I've got the answer right here." He smirked. He actually smirked. "By all means," he said, playing to the room, sure he'd already won it. "Enlighten us." I opened the envelope. I said, "This is a certified order from the 1st Judicial District Court, Kootenai County. It's signed by Judge Merritt." I held it up so Roy, closest to me, could see the raised seal, and I watched Roy, my Uncle Roy, who wouldn't look at me, lean in and read it and go still. On April 19th of last year, I said, the court appointed me the legal conservator of Grandpa's estate. That means a judge put me in charge of his money because his doctors said he could no longer manage it himself. It's on the public record. It's bonded. I've filed a full accounting with the court both years, to the penny, and any one of you can pull it tomorrow. I let that sit for one breath. April of last year, 2 months before Spencer had Grandpa sign a power of attorney in June. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice machine clunk down the hall. A power of attorney signed after a conservatorship is worthless, I said. It's paper. The judge already gave the authority to someone else, to me. I turned and looked directly at my cousin for the first time. So Spencer never had any authority over Grandpa's accounts at all. Not one day. Not $1. Spencer's face was doing the thing. I'd waited 18 months to watch it do the thing. The blood went out of it from the top down, forehead to jaw, like water draining out of a glass, and his mouth opened and nothing came out, and the beer bottle in his hand tipped just enough that a little foam ran over his knuckles, and he didn't notice. "The $60,000, I said, and I pulled the second document, "went here. A company called Selkirk Fiduciary. It's not a fiduciary firm. It's a shell. It's registered to Spencer's house on Ridgeview in Hayden. his name, his address, 14 transfers, $61,400, exactly, between June and March. I laid the bank summary on the table where Delphine could see it, and Delphine put her hand over her mouth. It bought that watch he's wearing. It bought Bree's Range Rover. It made 3 payments on their mortgage, and it paid for a week in Cabo last October. I looked at Bree, who had gone the color of the potato salad. You posted the sunset photos, October 12th. They're still up. You can't, Spencer started, and his voice cracked in the middle, and a couple of the cousins actually flinched at the sound of it, because none of us had ever heard Spencer's voice do that. I can, I said, because there's a third piece of paper. I set the last one down, and I said the sentence I had driven 3 months to be able to say in that room. On Friday, the court voided your power of attorney as a legal nullity and ordered full restitution. $61,400. The Selkirk account was frozen Friday afternoon. Every dollar goes back to Grandpa's estate, where it's protected, where you can't touch it, where a judge is watching it now. I paused. It's already done, Spencer. It was done before you stood up tonight. You called me a thief in front of the family, and by the time you opened your mouth, the money was already coming home. I did not gloat. I want you to know that. I stood there with my grandfather's watch, a cold weight against my knuckles inside the coat over my arm, and I felt no pleasure the way you'd think. I felt the level, quiet feeling of a boat that is finally settled dead level in the water. I looked at the man I'd once thought of as a brother, and I felt the last of that go, cleanly, like a line cut. The room turned. That's the part I'll remember longest. Not Spencer's white face, but the room turning. 40 people I'd grown up beneath swinging around all at once, like the hands of a clock snapping to the hour. Roy stood up. My Uncle Roy, who hadn't answered my texts in a month, stood up and put himself between me and Spencer, physically, and said, "Spencer, sit down." Delphine was crying and apologizing to me. "Oh, Marlo, oh, honey, we're so sorry, we should have known." And little Piper, my cousin Nadine's girl, 9 years old, the youngest one at the table, had been watching the whole thing with her chin on her hands, and in the total silence after Roy spoke, she said, to no one, "So Marlo was taking care of Grandpa the whole time?" "Yeah, baby," Nadine said, pulling her in, "the whole time." Spencer tried one more time to be Spencer. He said something about consulting his own attorney and this being harassment, and Bree grabbed his arm, and the two of them left. Actually left, walked out to the least white Tahoe in the gravel lot, while 40 people watched through the big windows, and the Tahoe didn't start on the first turn of the key. It cranked and caught on the second, and they drove off into the dark toward Hayden, with the money already gone out from under them. Nobody followed. Nobody said goodbye. Here's what happened after, because a story like this should end where it started, at a table with the family. Spencer's own lawyer told him within a week that the case was airtight, that a conservatorship order predates and voids a later POA every time, that the forged notary alone was a felony exposure, and that his best move was to shut up and repay. The full $61,400 came back into Grandpa's estate by September. Because I asked her to, and because it was the right thing and not a mercy Spencer earned, Corinne structured the restitution so the family didn't press for criminal charges beyond the restitution and the record. Grandpa, in a good hour, said he didn't want his grandson in a cell. He wanted his money in his account. And I keep my grandfather's bearing, so that's what we did. Spencer paid it back. He kept out of a courtroom. He also, by the following summer, had lost the wealth management job, sold the Range Rover, and moved out of the house in Hayden. And I did not lift one finger to make any of that happen. That was just the water finding its level once the money that had been holding him up went home. Selkirk Fiduciary dissolved. Bree stopped posting. Grandpa Walt died the next spring, in April, almost exactly a year after the reunion, in the memory care place with the window he liked. His estate was whole, every dollar accounted for, the way I'd promised him. What he had, he left to be split among the grandkids. And I made sure Spencer's share went straight to his kids in a trust he couldn't touch, because they were children and they hadn't done anything, and because that's what Grandpa would have wanted, and because I could afford now to be the one who kept the bearing for the whole family instead of just for one old man in an aluminum boat. The last part is the part I actually care about. This past July, the family did the reunion again at the same lodge on the North Shore, and it was a different kind of weekend. Lighter, the way a house is lighter after you find the thing that was rotting in the wall and take it out. Roy grilled. Delphine made the potato salad and put too much mustard in it like always. Nobody mentioned Spencer, who wasn't invited and didn't come. And at the Sunday dinner, at the long table, I did the one thing I'd been carrying around in my coat pocket for a year and a half waiting to do. I'd taken the watch in that morning to a jeweler in Coeur d'Alene and had the crystal polished and the case cleaned so the tarnish came off the numbers and the brass came up warm and gold again. But I'd told him to leave the 2 little dents on the back because Grandpa's father put those there and Grandpa's thumb had worn a shine into them over 60 years, and I wasn't about to erase the road it had traveled. Piper was at the table, 10 now, chin on her hands, same as before, the youngest one there. I took the watch out of my coat and I walked around the long table and I crouched down next to her and I opened her hand the way Grandpa opened mine on the lake when I was 7, and I set the warm brass into her palm and closed her fingers over it. "This was your great-grandpa's," I said, "and his father's before that. It always finds north, no matter which way the boat's pointed." She turned it over and found the 2 dents with her thumb, like she already knew to look for them. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because you're the one who asked the right question," I said. "You keep your own bearing, Piper. That's all it's ever been for." And I left it in her hands, and I went back to my seat, and I let the whole table watch a 10-year-old learn to read the needle.